Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching us from. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined this webinar to learn a little more about Relampo. Thank you so much for being here. The idea of this webinar isn't to show all of Relampo's features because that would be impossible, but what we do want to show is a complete real load test. Specifically, we'll be using a test website, a real application that simulates the behavior of an e-commerce site. And the idea is that we can record the script, do the correlation, do some scripting steps, debug that script, run that script for 500 virtual users. We'll be doing it locally and also in a distributed way. And then we'll be analyzing the reports that Relampo provides. I think we'll only be analyzing one of them due to time. We'll be looking at the HTML report so you can get to know a little bit about what happened with the tests and the analysis we need to do. So well, here on the screen, you're seeing the Relampo documentation. We have it available in Spanish and English. The idea of the documentation, well, everything we have in the tool is there. As you can see, we have Relampo CLI, which is the open source version of Relampo. It's a pretty complete version. In essence, what we'll be seeing today is all included in the CLI version. It's open source, free, and we also have an end-to-end visual version, but this version is currently in development. The Relampo team is developing this solution. Here in the documentation, you can find a lot of things like, for example, the first steps to interact with the tool, in case you want to try the tool, in case you want to see how to get started with the tool, where they explain a series of steps, a series of commands so you can get to know the tool. Relampo is based on scripting. As a scripting language, it uses YAML. As you know, YAML is a very easy to understand versionable script, and that's why we always emphasize that Relampo is for QA teams, meaning QA teams that can easily understand this tool. Here we also have, for example, the installation steps. It's available for all 3 operating systems. We have it for Mac, we have it for Windows, we have it for Linux. Here we also have some of the commands that the CLI offers. For example, record, correlate, debug, run, distributed run, the converter, which is a converter that allows converting Postman collections to Relampo YAML scripts. And we also have a very good, very intuitive visual editor to be able to script the application to understand what we have visually in that script. And of course, examples of how to use each of these features, right? The record, the correlate, and we also have a very good, very intuitive visual editor to be able to script the application to understand what we have visually in that script. And of course, examples of how to use each of these features, right? The record, the correlate. Here we also have the specification we've defined in Relampo for YAML scripting. All the components you have. Here you can see some examples, how they are manipulated, how each of them is specified. And we also have an example of a real test, which is the same website we're using for today's test. So today's webinar is not going to be focused on installation topics. For these installation topics, you have to go to the documentation here and download the tool. Due to time constraints, we are starting the installation. But I assure you it's very easy to understand, it's very easy to learn. So we're going to start first with recording a script. So to record a script, remember the first thing we have to do is open our terminal. And in the terminal, we're going to specify Relampo. Here is going to show us the first welcome screen of Relampo. Here you can see, for example, some commands that are included like setup, record, correlate. Each of them is specified in the documentation. I'm not going to focus too much on these commands. You can visit the documentation, and we will indeed be doing the recording of a script first. To record a script, we'll be using, as I mentioned earlier, a web that allows you to do small tests, scripting, and practice performance testing. Is something from the Relampo project itself. So I invite you to use this application so you can replicate everything we learned today in the webinar. We're going to start first with recording a script. And for recording a script, I'm going to show you here first the command we'll be using to record. Here, for example, you can see it would be Relampo record. Then we specify port 8888 or any available port you have at that moment you're doing the test. By default, we always use this port because it's easy to remember and is also quite commonly used in other script recording tools. Here, for example, port 8888, remember, you must keep in mind that it has to be specified in our web application. Okay, so we're going to go to our web application. Let's open the browser we're using here. In this case, I'm using Firefox. Here in the proxy configuration, we must specify port 8888, localhost here. We're going to click OK. And this would be the application. Okay, let's go back to continue explaining what this command consists of. I already told you about the port. We're going to specify a base URL. Why? Because the thing is that many times in that recording, other types of hosts are included that are not relevant to our test. So with this base URL, we are telling Relampo to simply capture everything that is on the testingyes.com domain. Okay? Then the next one would be responses. These responses are of vital importance. They are not mandatory to put in the recording command, but for example, if we want to perform the correlation process automatically, we must obtain the responses because, as you know, correlation allows capturing and updating the values sent between the responses and the request. So if we have the responses here, we can automatically do the correlation, which I'll show you a little later. And then we have where we're going to specify that we want to generate our script. In this case, we're going to call it by another name because I think I already created a script this way. Let's name it Delvis webinar. And then we're going to specify .yaml. Why? Because it's the extension we're using in Relampo for scripting. In other words, our script will be automatically generated from this recording with the YAML extension. And then we're going to be excluding all these embedded resources that we won't need for the scripting part. Okay, such as CSS, JavaScript, PNG, videos, images, all these embedded resources that we don't need for the scripting part. Here, as you can see, all these flags have in front --port, --base, --URL, --responses, --output, --exclude. So let's do the recording. Let's hit enter here. Once we're here, we're going to hit enter and we're going to go directly to the web. Before going to the web, right? I forgot. It's also important to keep in mind that we can also exclude prefixes from those requests to be able to associate them with user actions. Here we won't be doing the prefixes, but it's just so you keep in mind that it can be done too. So let's do a quick recording. Here, as you can see, it tells me that we are port 8888 was started and we are ready to begin our recording. Let's go to the web application. The first thing we're going to do in the web application is a homepage. We're going to do homepage in our application. Then we're going to do the login. Here I have some users. In case anyone is interested in doing this type of step, please contact me so I can send you all these users we use to generate load. Here we have the user, the email, the password. We're going to click sign in. We're going to buy tomatoes. We're going to add these tomatoes to the cart, and we're going to continue with the checkout process. We confirm the order. We're going to log out. And now in our CLI, we can see all the requests that were captured with that flow we were doing. So the next step would be Control C. In Control C, it's telling me that the YAML script was saved in this address. Okay, now we're going to directly correlate that script. Remember that we specified the responses, so we have the requests and the responses. We can do the correlation. For the correlation, it's very simple. It would be Relampo correlate, and we're going to pass it the script we just generated in our recording. Simply like this, Relampo correlate and the script. Once we are here, we are going to press enter, and automatically Relampo identifies for me which are the candidates to be correlated in this application. Remember that the correlation issue is super important because those are values that are dynamic, that travel in the responses, and that are later used in the requests. Therefore, since they are dynamic, if we make a recording and we keep that script ready without doing anything to it, and we run it against the server, is going to return errors. Why? Because we are sending values that are not generated dynamically. We are sending a value that was left behind, recorded. So the correlation process, what it allows is to be able to capture and process all those values and send them dynamically to the server. So in this case, remember, this is a simple web, it's a test web. We have a value which would be the security token. This security token has this value here. And Relampo tells us, let's see, Delvis, this security token travels in this URL, in the response of this request. Specifically, it travels in the body of that response. And then the application uses it, sends it back to the server in request 3, 6, 9, 11, and 12. So it gives me the whole process. That is, it captures for me where that value is sent and where it is sent back to the server. That is, the requests involved in this correlation. So I tell it here, okay, what I want now is to say that, yes, I agree. I want to apply that correlation in an automated way. I type Relampo correlate, the script, and I put apply. When I click apply, what Relampo does is that it automatically generates a regular expression associated with that value. It creates an extractor in that script in an automated way too, and then applies the value, that is the variable it assigned to that regular expression. It tells me it is applied in request 3, 6, 9, 11, and 12. This means that Relampo automatically does this whole correlation process, and then even the variable generated from that extractor, Relampo uses it in requests 3, 6, 9, 11, and 12. So in this way, the correlation is done automatically through Relampo. And as you can see here, it tells me it has run, that is, a correlation was applied, and the script that was correlated was this one here. And then it gives me a new script so that I can start scripting and start adding all the other components to that script. So now comes the part where we are going to open Relampo Studio. Relampo Studio is a component that we have developed in Relampo to be able to visualize, to be able to represent the YAML code visually in a node tree. So what we are going to be doing now is we are going to be opening Relampo Studio. Here I show you. We type Relampo Studio. Here I have it. And so this would be Relampo Studio. As you can see, it has a few components. It has for debugging, it has for running, and it also has the tree, which I'm going to show you how it can be used in a much easier and intuitive way, this component. Let's first load that already correlated script. Let's come here to this folder. Here, this script was the one I generated. Let's open it. As you can see here in a tree of nodes, I can see each of those requests with the information it has, whether it's the request, the responses, and everything it includes, all the details of each of them. Also, for example, I have another component such as the load. This load component here, I like it a lot because we can do it visually. For example, let's configure it for our 500 users. I want to generate 500 users. I want this test to last 5 minutes. It's going to be quite aggressive, but I want to show you errors in the tests. A single iteration, let's put 2 iterations, and let's put a ramp up of 2 minutes. As you can see here, I get a graph that models the load that I will be generating on my script. So for example, I also have the cookie manager. Here we can do it in an automated way. Relampo takes care of correlating the whole cookie issue, or if someone is interested in doing it manually for some specific issue of the application, they can do it manually. So here would be each of the requests. As you can see, I have answers, I have responses. Here, let's see the value that it extracted for me. As you can see, it automatically generated an extractor. This extractor contains the regular expression that Relampo associated with that value, and it tells me that the variable that will be used later on is going to be security token. So for example, let's look for where the application sends that value back. I think it's in request number 4 here. Perfect. Here you can see it also automatically substituted that value here in this request, specifically in the body. Here, as you can see, I have other values that are hard-coded, like the email and the password, but right now we're going to parameterize it. Remember that parameterization is possible because we can have an external file that feeds our script. So what we're going to do with this one is, for example, we're going to determine 2 variables, the email and the password, and we're going to have an external file, a CSV, where we're going to pass all the logins with their emails and passwords to the system. Why? Because if we want to generate 500 virtual users, we're going to need 500 real users so they can log in to that application and buy that product, and that way we can do the complete flow. So to do this, the first thing we're going to do here is, well, we're going to say that this is no longer going to be static. It's going to be dynamic. Variable declaration in Relampo, as you can see, is double parentheses. And here we're going to specify email. And we're going to do the same with the password. We're going to declare the variable and we're going to put pass. So we have to keep in mind that we must have a file, which would be this one here, which is where I'm going to have all my users with their passwords. So let's open this file so you can see it. Let's open it here. And here you can see where it opened for me. It opened on my other monitor. And here you can see then let's send it over here. Here in this CSV, I have all my, here they are, all my users, my emails, from Relampo 001 to Relampo 0500. Here you can see that I have all my users ready to run my tests, okay? So I already have that CSV. Now let's go back to our editor, to Relampo's Visual Studio. And here we're going to specify a new component. In other words, to be able to do the parameterization, Relampo is going to be using this component, which is a data source. In this data source, what we're going to do is specify that we have that .csv file ready to be used. Here, as you can see, we have a preview of this file for a bit more visibility to know what we have in that document, in that file. And here we're going to specify the variables. For example, let's say we have email and password. Remember that these variables must be the same ones we put here in the body in Relampo. So this way, what's going to happen is that when I run 500 users, each of those virtual users is going to use a specific user with their password, and it won't always be the same one. So this is how parameterization is done in Relampo. Another thing, one of the little things that Relampo also offers, we can, for example, add think times timers to these scripts. For example, I can specify that I want to make a timer of type from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. They can be done as a fixed value or distributed or as a range like I'm doing here. And so what's going to happen is that I can move this to the request where I want that pause to be. And this way, when the script runs, this request will take whatever is specified in that timer. So I won't do any more due to time constraints. But anyway, just so you know. Also, for example, we have other options like assertions. Assertions are used, as you know, for validation purposes when we want to check that the system alerts us when we have a 500 error, or when we want to verify that a specific text exists in a request. But anyway, in this test, since we're going to keep it simple, we're not going to add any assertions. You can just take a look at it later. We also have other things like, for example, the Spark before and after, which are the preprocessors. Here you can, for example, let's add a Spark after. Here you can write JavaScript code to extend a little bit more the functionalities of Relampo. We're not going to be using them either due to time constraints, but it's just so you get to know them. And well, it has many other features. You have, for example, you can add a file to those requests, or for example, you can create transactional type controllers, parallel type controllers, load balancers. You can also add conditionals like if, like loop, meaning different types of controllers to make the business logic quite precise from Relampo. So I think with this, we can do a first test. Let's save our script. Here, we download our script. Let's save it. And so what we're going to do now is the following. Before I launch those 500 users, it's important that I first run one or two users to see how each of those requests behaves from Relampo. That way we can see all the assertions we put in, all the variables that are generated, and to make sure it doesn't throw any 400 or 500 errors for those requests. So we implemented debug. Debug is a feature we can run from Relampo Studio right from here. And what it does is it runs that script I have for one or two users. Why is this important? Because we don't have to go directly from scripting to the actual execution, because we might have some kind of problem with our requests, with our variables, with our extractors, and then we only realize it when we're doing real tests. So with debugging, it's going to be very easy. We can, for example, let's tell it here that it's for just one to make it pretty fast. We can click Run Debug, and we can see everything that actually happens with our request in the application. As you can see, here in this one, I have an overview of what's happening. This is a redirect. Then comes, for example, what is sent in the request, what is received as a response. If we put any assertions, they will show up here. If it has any associated variable used in that request, it also shows up here. And also the logs, just to understand if something happens. So for example, let's look for something. For example, this same request we made for the logging, I think it was number 4. Okay, in number 4, where we pass the security token, the email, and the password, right? So let's go to debug and select number 4. And we'll see here that it tells me Well, look, here the security token is being correctly captured, the email, and the password. In other words, it's correctly reading the file I gave it with the users and passwords, and it's also successfully grabbing the extractor from the correlation process we did. Okay, so anyway, this is just to understand everything that happens. We can make an intentional error here. For example, let's think here, let's put demo 4 in the path here to trigger a 404 error. And let's run this request again. As you can see here, we did this intentionally. It has a 404. It says this failed. And so here we can look for why specifically this failed, right? The 400 error. So anyway, it's just to understand what this way of debugging is about. We're doing it really fast, really simple, but it's so you keep in mind that it's super important that when we're going to run 500 virtual users, we first debug our script to see if it's working for 1 or 2 users. The variables, the correlation, the assertions, the timers, all these issues that are super important to validate before going to a real execution. So here we have a component where we can do a test visually, but first we're going to do the test locally so you can see how it works. Okay, so to run it, to do a test locally, what we're going to do is the following. We're going to open the terminal, and here in the terminal, well, we're going to press Control C to be able to we type Relampo Studio, Relampo run, and what we're going to do is pass it. We're going to pass it the script we're using at that moment. So at this moment, the script we're using, let's go back to the CLI. Let's say I want to run, sorry, it's not this one. Let's find the exact script. The script that is ready is this one. And let's say, well, I want to run this script here. If for some reason I want to, for example, I specified 500 virtual users in the editor from the load configuration, but I want to override those characteristics I'm setting, that data of 500 users, I can say, well, I only want to run 5 virtual users. I can specify from here, from the command line, what I want to do. But what will happen is that this will override those 500 users in the script. But anyway, I want to do a real test so you can see how they work. We're doing this locally, then we'll do it in a distributed way. Okay, let's do a test. Here you can see it starts showing my table of all the results happening with my test, each of the requests. It's showing me here what's being done, the hits, the samples for each of them, the errors, and a set of metrics such as the minimum, the maximum, the average, the 90th percentile. And of course, it starts giving me errors because that server we have is very small, very basic, and doesn't support 500 concurrent users. So here it starts showing me the errors, and each of them tells me a 508, a 503, all these errors. But something interesting we've implemented in Relampo is this part here where we're monitoring what's happening with the load generator machine. In other words, in this case, I'm generating my load locally, and as you can see, it shows me CPU usage and the errors we're having. Okay, so I'm going to stop this test. This was just so you could see how it behaves. Here you can see it shows me my table. Just so you can see how a test happens locally. Let's press Control C to end that test. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to do a visual test still locally. Okay, so you can see the difference. From here, it's much easier, much more intuitive, but for those who prefer the CLI, they can launch it from the CLI, or if they prefer the visual part, they can also do it visually from here. Visually here, what's going to happen is the following. And here in run, what we're going to do is we're going to take this test. As you can see here, it shows me a set of metrics. They are very basic metrics. Here it's outputting each of the logs. And here, as you can see, it shows me the timing of this test, which would be 5 minutes, 2 minutes of ramp up. And as you can see here, this yellow line is moving along the time axis and telling me how our load ramp up is behaving. As you can see here, we have the performance, the throughput, the 95th percentile, the active users. Right now we have 118 active users, and it's showing me each of these logs accordingly because it's showing a lot of errors. I can click stop. So it's showing me, for example, each of the requests, the impact it had, a set of metrics. And the interesting thing about doing it visually from here is that we can open the report here. And as you can see in this report, it shows me these beautiful charts related to, for example, the yellow is the request per second, the blue would be the virtual users, the green would be the average, the mean. We also have the 95th percentile and the errors. So if we hover, for example, here, we can see what happens specifically at 8:05 in the morning with each of those metrics. We also have a table that specifies each of the requests and the metrics associated with those requests. And it also shows us here the failures for each of those requests and gives us an insight into what's happening with our application. So we did this locally from our computer. The important thing to keep in mind here is that it's not recommended to do it locally. Why? Because of the conditions we have on our PC, which are not prepared to generate load because many of the computer's components are used by other programs. So what we recommend is to use Relampo in a distributed way. And that's what we're going to do now. Run a test in a distributed way with the integration of Relampo with GitHub Actions. This is very interesting because it supports up to 500 virtual users for free at no cost. In other words, you can distribute your tests across 4 nodes and 500 virtual users. This means that if you have 500 virtual users, you can put 125, 125, 125, and 125 on each of them. Sorry, if you have 5 nodes, 500 to make it clearer, you can put 100 on each of them, and you don't have to be and you shouldn't be sending all 500 from a single computer, from a single load generator machine. So the idea is that we're going to do a test in a distributed way now. The command we'll be using first is Relampo distribute setup. Let's do it here so you can see. What this will do is check if all the requirements are met. For example, if I have GitHub installed, if I have Git installed, if I have GitHub authentication set up correctly on my computer, and also prepare the repository where I'm going to run my tests. In this case, we're going to call it Relampo demo. So what's going to happen is that if I don't have a repository named Relampo demo, it's going to tell me, hey, you don't have that repository in your GitHub account. So we're going to create a repository with that name so you can start using it. So it automatically creates a repository where I'll be running these tests. Then to make sure everything is fine with my repository on GitHub, we're going to enter this command here, Relampo distribute setup, and pass it our repository, hit enter, and it'll tell us that everything is correct with our repository, that it's ready to start running our tests. So importantly, remember, we're going to be running the tests in a distributed way on GitHub from the cloud. So what's going to happen is that I need to upload the YAML script I'm going to execute to that repository along with all the files needed to run that test. In our case, the CSV file where we'll be feeding the usernames and passwords to perform each of those logins. This is very common in all these tools that allow testing from the cloud, because remember, we're going to use GitHub action nodes, which specifically are load generator machines. So I already have this command here. I'll show it to you so you can see. Here with this command, what I'm saying is, okay, Relampo distribute files upload. meaning I'm going to upload the files. I specify which repository I'm going to upload them to. In this case, the repository we created earlier. And then I'm going to tell it which files I'm going to upload to that repository. In this case, as I was saying, we're going to upload this user file that contains the email and password, and we're also going to upload this script we created earlier, already parameterized and correlated. So let's hit enter. What it's going to do is take those files and upload them to our repository, and these files were successfully uploaded to this repository. So now we're ready to start running a test. We're going to do a pretty basic one. This would be the command to run the load in a distributed way. Let's see. First, we're going to tell it Relampo distribute run. We're going to pass it the script we want to run. Then we're going to specify specifically the repository we created earlier, Relampo demo. Then we're going to say we want to generate the load from 4 generator machines, 4 nodes, and 500 users. That means Relampo will take those 500 users and distribute them evenly among the 4 nodes, meaning it will run a load of 125, 125, 125, and 125 from 4 nodes. That way we can balance the load. We'll also be specifying the duration, which will be 5 minutes, and we'll be generating 2 reports, specifically a JSON and an HTML. So the next step would be to run this load. Let's see here. As you can see now, it tells me it's running in the Relampo demo repository. The script being run is delvis.yaml with 500 users and a duration of 5 minutes. And it tells me to, well, go to this link where the test is running. It also tells me this isn't magic, that Relampo is just working. Right now it's preparing the nodes on GitHub. Let's grab that link and go over here and say, let's see. As you can see, it's spinning up the 4 nodes. You can see here, I can go one by one to see what's happening. The test started on this node. We can go to the second node to see what's happening. The test started and it gives me a set of metrics, a set of logs of what's happening with my test, right? Now this lasts 5 minutes. After this, what's going to happen is it will generate an HTML report and show me here in the CLI what happened with those tests. Here, as you can see, the 4 nodes have finished running the test, each node with its results. Let's go to the CLI then to see the results we show in the CLI from the terminal. As you can see here in the terminal, it shows me each of those requests we had, the samples we had, the errors, lots of errors. Remember, this is a very small server. I think it's a server with 500 megabytes of memory, very small. It can't handle these 500 users. Here, for example, we have some alerts for 90th percentiles greater than 8 seconds and 15 seconds. Here it specifies, for example, that if any of them takes more than 8 seconds, it gives me an alert. Here it specifies what happened with each of its nodes, specifically with memory processing, CPU processing. It tells me specifically the peaks each of them had. It also gives me a quick interpretation of what happened with this test. It tells me this test was critical, that it had an 87% error rate, and it gives me some signals, for example, about the 90th percentiles, the CPU, the memory, and it tells me I can find the reports in this folder. So let's go to those folders for a second. These would be the reports. Let's see, we have an HTML report and we also have a JSON report. Let's open the HTML report. As you can see, a huge degradation of the test. It lasted 5 minutes. 500 virtual users were launched against it. It had this total number of requests, a set of general metrics here. I have a chart here that shows me the timeline of my test. The blue one tells me how the ramp-up period of the users was, the virtual users. They also specify, for example, in red, the errors it had. The requests per second is the yellow one. I can remove some and only leave the ones I want to see. For example, I'd like to see virtual users and the behavior of the 95th percentile here. So this way I can look here, observing and analyzing what those general metrics were. It does this globally, but something that Relampo is also implementing is that I can see the behavior differentiated by each of the nodes, that is the load generator machines. For example, node 1, how node 1 behaved, or how node 2 behaved, or how node 4 behaved, and we can see how each of those nodes behaved. Then it gives me a table where I can see each of the requests, each of the associated metrics. As you can see, that test was critical. It had maximum response times of almost a minute, and I can even see the redirects. I can see everything that happened in this test here. Another very interesting chart we've implemented is the one showing what happens with the CPU and memory behavior of the load generator machines. Like the one above, here we can analyze it globally, but we can also see it for each of those nodes. And so if we go to each of those nodes, we can see in green is the memory usage, and in purple is the CPU usage. As you can see, there are some peaks here. Let's look at all of it. Here, these peaks go up to, let's see here, up to 35 megabytes and an 8.9% CPU processing. And here we can see it in a small table, the behavior each of them had. Then the next one would be a summary of each of the errors per request, what was happening with each of them. For example, a 508 status here, and so on. And here in findings, it's going to give me a summary of how my tests behaved overall. For example, that it was critical because there was an 87% error rate. It's going to tell me that the 95th percentile was also very high, and so on. A set of metrics and insights associated with my performance tests. So that was the test. It was a simple test, but it was a complete load test covering the main features of Relampo. So if you have any questions or doubts, please, we can start the Q&A session.